Josef Mengele was born on the 16th of March, 1911, in the prosperous Bavarian town of Günzburg, into a world that seemed designed to produce respectable citizens, not architects of genocide. His father, Karl Mengele, had built a successful agricultural equipment manufacturing business that would eventually employ hundreds of workers and make the Mengele name synonymous with quality farming machinery throughout southern Germany. The factory, established in 1908, produced threshing machines and other agricultural implements that were sold across Bavaria and beyond, creating considerable wealth for the family. The Mengeles lived comfortably in a substantial three-story house at Heidenheimer Strasse on the town's main street, attended Catholic Mass regularly at St. Martin's Church, and embodied the values of industriousness and German respectability that defined the pre-war middle class. Young Joseph grew up with two brothers, Karl Jr., born in 1912, and Alois, born in 1914 inches, an atmosphere of strict discipline and high expectations, where academic achievement and social status mattered enormously. The family employed servants, maintained a large garden, and participated actively in Günzburg's social life, hosting dinner parties and attending cultural events. Nothing in this conventional upbringing suggested the horror that this well-fed, well-educated boy would eventually inflict upon thousands. Günzburg itself, a picturesque medieval town on the Danube River with barely 10,000 inhabitants, prided itself on its orderliness and traditional values, making it seem an unlikely birthplace for one of history's most notorious criminals. The Mengele family dynamic, however, contained seeds of the coldness that would later define Josef's character. His mother, Walburga, described by neighbors as pious but stern, maintained an emotional distance from her children, favoring Joseph's younger brother Alois, while treating Joseph with a chilly formality that several biographers have noted. One family friend later recalled that Walburga never showed physical affection to Josef, never embraced him, even as a small child. His father Karl ruled the household with authoritarian strictness, demanding excellence and showing little affection, viewing his sons primarily as future stewards of the family business rather than as children needing warmth and guidance. Former classmates and teachers at the Günzburg Realgymnasium remembered Josef as intelligent but aloof, ambitious but lacking warmth, a boy who excelled academically, not from genuine curiosity, but from a desire to prove his superiority. He graduated with top marks in 1930, particularly excelling in biology and physics. One childhood acquaintance, Fritz Bauer, later recalled that even as a youngster, Mengele displayed a certain arrogance, as if he already knew he was destined for greater things than the rest of us. He never played with other children in the spontaneous way boys do. Everything was calculated. This emotional coldness, this sense of being special and separate, would later manifest in his ability to select thousands for death while maintaining the detached demeanor of a scientist cataloging specimens. Mengele's academic journey began at the University of Munich in 1930, where he initially studied philosophy before gravitating toward medicine and anthropology. This was a pivotal moment in German intellectual history, when universities had become hotbeds of racial science and eugenic theory. The Treaty of Versailles had left Germany humiliated and economically devastated, stripped of territory, forced to pay crippling reparations, and forbidden from maintaining a significant military. This created fertile ground for ideologies that promised to restore German greatness through racial purity. Mengele arrived at university just as the Nazi Party was gaining mainstream political acceptance, transforming from a fringe movement into a powerful force that would capture 37% of the vote in July 1932 and eventually enable Hitler's appointment as Chancellor in January 1933. At Munich, he studied under Theodor Mollison, a prominent anthropologist who specialized in racial differences and supported eugenic theories about the superiority of Nordic peoples. Mollison's lectures drew large audiences of students eager to embrace scientific-sounding justifications for German nationalism. Mollison taught that races could be scientifically classified and ranked through cranial measurements, facial angles, and other physical characteristics, with Germanic peoples at the apex of human evolution ideas that Mengele absorbed with the enthusiasm of a true believer finding his calling. He joined the Stahlhelm, a nationalist paramilitary organization, in 1931, demonstrating his political leanings even before the Nazi seizure of power. His university transcripts show exceptional grades in anatomy, anthropology, and genetics, subjects that would later form the foundation of his pseudo-scientific work at Auschwitz. In 1935, Mengele moved to Frankfurt to pursue his doctorate under Ottmar Freiherr von Verschuer, one of Germany's most respected geneticists and a leading advocate of racial hygiene. Von Verschuer, who would later serve as director of the prestigious Kaiser Wilhelm Institute of Anthropology, Human Heredity, and Eugenics in Berlin-Dahlem, became Mengele's mentor and ideological guide. The institute, funded by the Rockefeller Foundation until 1939 and supported by German industry, represented the mainstream acceptance of eugenic research in pre-war Germany. Under von Verschuer's supervision, Mengele wrote his doctoral thesis titled Racial Morphological Research on the lower jaw section of 4 racial groups, measuring hundreds of skulls and jaw structures to demonstrate supposed anatomical variations between races. He spent months in Frankfurt's Senckenberg Museum, measuring skeletal remains and photographing specimens, producing elaborate charts and statistical analyses that gave his conclusions a veneer of scientific rigor. The work was pseudo-scientific nonsense, dressed in academic language, relying on cherry-picked data and predetermined conclusions. But it earned him his doctorate in 1935 and deepened his conviction that scientific research could unlock the secrets of racial superiority. Von Verschuer praised his students' meticulous attention to detail and his willingness to pursue research unhindered by sentimental considerations, a chilling foreshadowing of what was to come. The mentor-protégé relationship would continue throughout the war, with Mengele shipping research materials including the eyes of murdered twins preserved in formaldehyde, blood samples, and internal organs from Auschwitz to von Verschuer's institute in Berlin, and von Verschuer providing scientific justification for experiments that had no legitimate medical purpose. In correspondence later discovered by Allied investigators, von Verschuer wrote to colleagues about the excellent research material his former student was providing from the Eastern Territories, never acknowledging that this material came from murdered prisoners. The Nazis had implemented the Nuremberg laws of 1935, stripping Jews of citizenship and prohibiting intermarriage between Jews and Aryans. Forced sterilization programs, implemented under the 1933 law for the prevention of hereditarily diseased offspring, had already sterilized over 350,000 Germans deemed genetically inferior, the mentally ill, the physically disabled, chronic alcoholics, the deaf, the blind, and others classified as life unworthy of life. Mengele embraced these policies enthusiastically, seeing them as necessary steps toward improving the genetic stock of the German Volk. He worked briefly at the Institute for Hereditary Biology and Racial Hygiene in Frankfurt, where he assisted with research determining whether individuals of mixed heritage should be classified as Jewish or Aryan, research that would directly determine whether people lived or died under Nazi racial laws. He married Irene Schönbein on the 28th of July 1939, the daughter of a wealthy Freiburg businessman who owned a furniture factory, in a ceremony held at the family estate. Friends described the union as loveless and pragmatic, a marriage designed to produce Aryan children and advance social standing rather than from any genuine affection. Irene later told relatives that Josef seemed incapable of real emotional connection and was obsessed with his career to the exclusion of everything else. When war broke out in September 1939 with the invasion of Poland, Mengele volunteered for military service, joining the Waffen-SS and serving with a reserve medical unit attached to the 5th SS Panzer Division, Viking, on the Eastern Front. His military service proved brief but formative. In 1942, while serving in Ukraine during Operation Barbarossa, Mengele received the Iron Cross Second Class for pulling 2 wounded soldiers from a burning tank under enemy fire near the village of Rostov, an act of bravery that seemed at odds with his later callousness toward human suffering. yet perhaps revealed his complex psychology. He could value certain lives, German soldiers, Aryan warriors, members of his racial community, while viewing others as entirely expendable. Fellow soldiers remembered him as competent but peculiar, someone who seemed more interested in collecting biological specimens from the conquered territories than in the camaraderie of military life. He reportedly kept jars of preserved insects and small animals in his field kit, specimens he planned to study when time permitted. Later that year, he was severely wounded when his unit came under heavy Soviet artillery fire during the Battle of Stalingrad, suffering injuries to his back and legs that required hospitalization in Berlin and left him with a permanent limp. He was decorated with the Iron Cross First Class, the Wound Badge in Black, and the Medal for the Care of the German People, and declared unfit for further frontline combat service in January 1943. This injury, which might have seemed like a career setback, instead opened the path to Auschwitz. In early 1943, with his mentor von Verschuer's strong recommendation and his SS credentials, Mengele received appointment as a camp physician at Auschwitz-Birkenau, the massive death camp complex in occupied Poland, where the Nazis were implementing the final solution to the Jewish question. He arrived at Auschwitz on the 30th of May, 1943, a 32-year-old doctor with impeccable academic credentials, Nazi ideological purity, military decorations for bravery, and an opportunity to conduct research on an unlimited supply of human subjects who had no rights, no protection, and no hope. Auschwitz transformed Mengele from a mediocre racial scientist into the angel of death. The camp's selection platform, or ramp, where arriving trains disgorged thousands of Jewish prisoners each week, became his domain and the site of his most visible crimes. The Birkenau complex, which became operational in October 1941, had been specifically designed for mass murder, with 4 large gas chambers and crematoria capable of killing and disposing of thousands of people per day. SS doctors were required to perform selections, the euphemistic term for deciding who would be sent immediately to the gas chambers, typically the elderly, children, pregnant women, and anyone deemed unfit for labor and who would be temporarily spared for forced labor in the camp's factories and workshops. Most SS physicians detested this duty, viewing it as beneath their professional dignity and psychologically traumatic. Dr. Edward Worths, the chief camp physician, frequently requested transfers for doctors who couldn't handle the psychological strain of selections. Some physicians requested transfers to the Eastern Front, preferring combat to the moral degradation of the selection ramp. Others arrived drunk to numb themselves to the horror or delegated the task to subordinates whenever possible. Mengele approached selections with unsettling enthusiasm, often appearing on the platform even when not scheduled, sometimes showing up 3 or 4 times a week when he was only required to serve once. He dressed in an immaculate SS uniform, polished boots gleaming even in muddy conditions, white gloves always spotless, occasionally whistling opera tunes, particularly arias from Wagner's operas, as he casually gestured people toward life or death with a flick of his riding crop or a pointed finger. Survivors remembered his fastidious appearance in the midst of chaos, the way he seemed to take aesthetic pleasure in the performance of selection, treating it almost as a theatrical presentation. Vera Kriegel, a Czech Jew who survived Auschwitz after arriving in 1944, later testified that Mengele looked like a movie star, tall and handsome in his SS uniform, and he moved among us with complete calm, as if he were selecting vegetables at a market. He had this little smile, not cruel exactly, but pleased with himself, as if he was enjoying showing off his authority. Another survivor, Eva Moses Kor, who arrived at Auschwitz as a 10-year-old twin with her family from the village of Ports, Romania, in May 1944, recalled her first sight of Mengele. "We had been crammed in a cattle car for 4 days without food or water. When the doors finally opened, there was chaos dogs barking, SS guards shouting, people screaming. Then I saw him. He looked at us, a sea of people, and he started shouting, 'Zwillinge, Zwillinge, twins, twins.' My mother pushed my twin sister Miriam and me forward, thinking perhaps that would save us. We were pulled aside, and that was the last time I saw my mother, my father, and my two older sisters. They were gassed that same day, but I didn't know it then. This ability to appear civilized and even charming while orchestrating mass murder defined Mengele's persona at Auschwitz. He could conduct a selection in the morning, sending 2,000 or 3,000 people to the gas chambers before noon, then spend his afternoon performing excruciating experiments on conscious prisoners in Block 10, the medical experimentation barracks, and finish his evening playing classical music on the phonograph in his quarters while sipping fine wine looted from the possessions of murdered prisoners and discussing philosophy with fellow SS officers. Within the camp's hierarchy, Mengele cultivated a bizarre duality that both fascinated and terrified prisoners. He could be unexpectedly generous by camp standards, occasionally sparing prisoners he found useful or interesting, providing extra food rations, additional bread or margarine to his research subjects to keep them alive for further experimentation, or even intervening to stop other SS guards from beating prisoners, not from compassion, but from a proprietary interest in his human experimental material. He once reportedly shot an SS guard who had killed one of his twin subjects without permission, furious that his research had been disrupted. He maintained a special barracks for twins, the Zwillingslager, where children received slightly better food, were allowed to keep their hair, and were spared the immediate death that most children faced upon arrival. But this apparent mercy was merely a delay of execution. Almost all of these twins would eventually die from his experiments or be murdered when their research value was exhausted. Dr. Miklos Niisli, a Hungarian Jewish physician and forensic pathologist, forced to assist Mengele in his dissection work, wrote in his memoir an immense capacity for separating his scientific interests from any human feeling. Niisli described watching Mengele dissect a pair of 7-year-old twins he had murdered with chloroform injections to the heart just hours earlier, taking meticulous notes about anatomical variations in their organs, completely absorbed in his work as if the corpses before him were laboratory specimens rather than children who had been alive that morning, playing with toys Mengele himself had given them. When Niisli once ventured to suggest that a particular experiment injecting dye into children's eyes to try to change their color seemed unnecessarily cruel and scientifically pointless, Mengele responded with genuine puzzlement, asking, "How can scientific research be cruel? We are advancing human knowledge. These people are going to die anyway. At least their deaths will have meaning and contribute to science." This conviction that he was conducting legitimate science rather than torture defined Mengele's self-image and allowed him to commit atrocities without apparent psychological distress. He maintained detailed records in leather-bound notebooks, took extensive measurements with calipers and measuring tapes imported from Germany, preserved organs in formaldehyde in hundreds of specimen jars, created elaborate charts tracking hereditary traits, and shipped research materials to von Verschuer's Institute in Berlin, all while maintaining the outward appearance of a dedicated physician-scientist. His surviving research notes, discovered after the war, revealed an obsession with twins, dwarves, people with heterochromia, and various physical abnormalities. He maintained a collection of eyes, carefully labeled and preserved, from twins he had murdered, hoping to prove theories about the genetic basis of eye color. He conducted experiments attempting to artificially create Siamese twins by surgically connecting blood vessels between separate children, procedures that invariably resulted in agonizing deaths from infection and gangrene. His colleagues in the SS Medical Corps found him strange, too enthusiastic about his work, too eager for the arrival of new transports that would provide fresh experimental subjects. Dr. Hans Munch, one of the few SS doctors at Auschwitz later acquitted of war crimes, testified that Mengele was fanatically devoted to his research and seemed to have no normal human reactions to suffering. Munch recalled that Mengele became visibly excited when transports from certain regions arrived, knowing they might contain twins or people with unusual physical characteristics. Some prisoners called him the White Angel for his immaculate appearance. Others knew him as the Angel of Death. Both names captured the surreal horror of an educated, cultured man who embodied civilization's complete collapse, who could listen to Schubert's Lieder while contemplating which children to dissect, who kept a collection of classical records in his quarters, and could discuss Goethe and Schiller while planning experiments that would kill dozens. He represented the terrifying truth that ordinary education, scientific training, and bourgeois respectability offered no protection against moral monstrosity when placed in the service of genocidal ideology. As the historian Robert J. Lifton would later write in The Nazi Doctors, Mengele demonstrated how healing and killing could be fused in a single professional identity, creating what Lifton termed Faustian bargain, in which medical knowledge was completely divorced from medical ethics, producing a physician who could simultaneously hold a crying child and prepare an injection that would kill that child, all while maintaining the self-image of a dedicated scientist advancing human knowledge. The twins' barracks at Auschwitz-Birkenau stood apart from the other prisoner blocks, a location that might have seemed like salvation to the children housed within. Here, unlike elsewhere in the camp, children kept their hair, received slightly larger food rations, and were allowed toys and occasional treats. Block 14 inches, the women's camp at Birkenau, became known as the Zwillingslager, the twins' camp where wooden bunks held the precious human specimens Mengele collected with obsessive fervor. Parents who had been separated from their twins during selection sometimes heard rumors of this special treatment and dared to hope their children might survive. They could not have imagined the true purpose of this relative mercy, that these children were being fattened and maintained not for life, but for more valuable deaths as experimental subjects in Josef Mengele's obsessive quest to unlock the secrets of heredity through the most macabre research program in medical history. The barracks, overseen by prisoner guards like Vera Alexander, a Jewish woman from Slovakia who later testified at the Auschwitz trials, maintained an eerie atmosphere of normalcy punctuated by terror. Alexander recalled that the children had dolls and toy soldiers, little wooden animals carved by prisoners. Mengele himself would sometimes bring them chocolates or candy. Then the next day, he would take several of them away for experiments, and they would return, if they returned at all, screaming in pain or too traumatized to speak. Mengele's fascination with twins bordered on mania, consuming his thoughts and directing his actions on the selection ramp, where he would appear even on his days off, eagerly scanning arriving transports for the telltale sight of identical faces. "Zwillinge heraus," he would shout. "Twins, step forward." And families would push their twin children to the front, believing this meant safety. Between May 1943 and January 1945, Mengele assembled approximately 1,500 sets of twins at Auschwitz, with subjects ranging from newborn infants to elderly adults in their 70s, though he showed particular interest in children between the ages of 5 and 12. Eva and Miriam Moses, 10-year-old identical twins from the village of Ports in Transylvania, found themselves among this collection in May 1944, part of a massive transport of 438,000 Hungarian Jews deported to Auschwitz during a concentrated 6-week period. Eva later recalled the initial examination that all twins underwent. "We were taken to a room in the sauna building. That's what they called the disinfection facility, where SS men measured every part of our bodies. They measured our heads with metal calipers that pinched our skin, the distance between our eyes, the width of our noses, the length of our ears, the circumference of our skulls. Everything was recorded in charts with German labels we couldn't read. It took hours, and we stood there without clothing and shivering while they compared us to see how identical we were." Mengele stood watching, making notes in a leather-bound journal, looking pleased, occasionally asking questions in German to his assistants. Sometimes he would touch our faces, turning our heads this way and that, examining our teeth like we were horses. These preliminary measurements represented merely the beginning of Mengele's twin research program, which operated under the theoretical framework provided by his mentor Ottmar von Verschwer, who remained safely in Berlin throughout the war years, directing the prestigious Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, while his former student conducted fieldwork that violated every principle of medical ethics. The scientific rationale, such as it was, held that by comparing identical twins who shared the same genetic material with fraternal twins and with each other after subjecting them to various interventions, Researchers could isolate the effects of heredity versus environment and understand the genetic basis of physical and behavioral traits. Von Verschuer had published extensively on twin studies before the war, using conventional research methods and earning international respect in the genetics community, even receiving funding from the American Rockefeller Foundation until 1939. What Mengele proposed was to advance this research by removing all ethical constraints, treating human subjects as laboratory animals that could be manipulated, dissected, and destroyed in pursuit of data. The experiments that followed bore no resemblance to legitimate science, producing no publishable results and contributing nothing to medical knowledge. Yet Mengele pursued them with relentless dedication, maintaining meticulous records that documented suffering but proved nothing. Dr. Miklos Nyszly, the Hungarian pathologist forced to assist Mengele, observed in his memoir that Mengele lived for his research. He would work 18 hours at a stretch, completely absorbed in measurements and dissections, treating the human body as nothing more than a collection of data points to be catalogued and analyzed. The daily routine for twins in Mengele's experimental blocks followed a horrifying pattern that survivors would remember with crystalline clarity decades later. 3 times per week, sometimes more frequently depending on Mengele's research schedule, they would be taken from Block 14 to the medical experimentation facilities in Block 10 or to the crematorium area where Mengele maintained a private laboratory. Blood extractions occurred constantly, with Mengele sometimes draining dangerous quantities up to a liter at a time from children who weighed perhaps 30 or 40 kilograms and whose small bodies could ill afford such losses. Zvi Spiegel, a twin from Hungary who survived these extractions, testified at the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials in 1964 that they would take blood from one arm until we fainted, then they would revive us with cold water or smelling salts and take blood from the other arm. The room would spin, and I could feel my heart racing, struggling to pump blood that wasn't there anymore. Some children never woke up after these blood drawings. They simply died on the table, and their bodies would be taken away for autopsy. I remember a pair of twins from Poland, brothers maybe 6 years old, who died during one of these sessions. Mengele showed no emotion. He simply made a note in his book and called for the next pair of twins. The blood samples were carefully labeled with prisoner numbers and twin designations, sealed in vials, and shipped via SS courier to von Verschuer's Institute in Berlin, where researchers attempted to identify hereditary markers for various diseases and characteristics. Mengele also conducted comparative blood transfusions between twins, taking blood from one twin and injecting it directly into the other to observe immunological reactions, procedures that often resulted in severe fever, hemolytic reactions, kidney failure, and death from incompatible blood types. The eye experiments represented perhaps Mengele's most obsessive line of research, driven by his fanatical desire to change brown eyes to blue, to literally transform Jews and other inferior peoples into Aryans through medical intervention, fulfilling a perverse interpretation of Nazi racial ideology. He collected eyes from murdered prisoners the way a philatelist collects stamps, maintaining dozens of specimen jars containing eyes of different colors carefully preserved in formaldehyde solutions on shelves in his laboratory. The walls of his workspace in Crematorium 2 were decorated with these macabre displays, rows of human eyes staring sightlessly from their glass containers, labeled with handwritten tags noting the prisoner number, eye color, and other identifying characteristics. But Mengele wanted to create blue eyes in living subjects, not merely collect them from the dead. He began injecting methylene blue and other chemical dyes directly into children's eyes, sometimes multiple times per day, procedures performed without any form of anesthesia, while assistants held the screaming children down on examination tables. Witness testimony from Dr. Nyszly describes children returning from these procedures with eyes swollen shut, faces streaked with tears mixed with blood and pus, suffering severe chemical burns to the conjunctiva and cornea that often led to blindness, excruciating pain, and sometimes death from infections that spread to the brain. In some cases, Mengele surgically removed eyes from living subjects to study the effect of his interventions on optical tissue, using crude extraction techniques that frequently damaged surrounding facial structures. Eva Moses Kor, remembered one particular session in vivid detail. They strapped me to a table with leather restraints on my wrists and ankles. I could see Mengele preparing syringes, filling them with different colored liquids: blue, green, brown. Then he came toward me with the needle. They forced my eyelids open with metal clips, and Mengele himself injected something directly into my eyes. The pain was indescribable, like fire burning inside my head, like someone was driving hot nails through my eyeballs into my brain. I screamed until my voice gave out, until I was just making these horrible rasping sounds. For days afterward, I couldn't see properly, everything was blurred, and there were spots of color everywhere, strange halos around objects. My sister Miriam thought I was going blind. She cried at night, holding my hand, praying I would be able to see again. Mengele's experiments on twins extended far beyond eyes and blood into realms of surgical mutilation that defied rational scientific purpose. He conducted comparative surgeries, performing identical operations on both twins to observe whether healing rates differed, sometimes deliberately infecting surgical wounds with bacteria cultures to study immune responses and infection progression. Moshe Offer, a twin from Czechoslovakia who survived Auschwitz, testified in a 1985 interview about witnessing Mengele perform a primitive sex change operation on a set of 7-year-old identical twin boys named Guido and Nino from an Italian Jewish family. Mengele was obsessed with the question of whether sexual characteristics were determined purely by genetics or could be altered through surgical intervention, Offer recalled. He castrated both boys, then attempted reconstructive procedures on one of them using methods too distressing to detail. Both boys died from massive infections within days, screaming in agony the entire time. Their bodies were immediately autopsied, their sexual organs preserved in jars for Mengele's collection. In another series of experiments conducted in late 1944, Mengele attempted to create conjoined twins by surgically connecting blood vessels and organs between separate twins, working from the bizarre theory that if identical twins shared such similar genetics, their bodies might accept grafting from each other without rejection. These operations, conducted in crude conditions with primitive surgical tools and minimal antiseptic precautions, invariably resulted in gangrene, sepsis, and agonizing death within a week. Dr. Niesli documented one such attempt, where Mengele connected the back of one twin to the back of another, first removing sections of their spinal muscles and ribs, then suturing their circulatory systems together to create a shared blood supply. The children, a pair of Roma twins named Guido and Rina, who were about 4 years old, survived for 4 days in unspeakable agony, their bodies essentially rotting while still alive as infection spread through the surgical connections. They screamed continuously until Mengele finally administered morphine overdoses to end their suffering and preserve their bodies for autopsy, during which he meticulously documented the surgical connections and infection pathways with detailed anatomical drawings. The treatment of pregnant women in Mengele's experimental program revealed the depths of his depravity cloaked as reproductive research. Standard Auschwitz protocols sent pregnant women directly to the gas chambers upon arrival, as they were deemed unfit for labor, and their pregnancies represented what the Nazis considered a drain on camp resources. Mengele, however, requested that pregnant women be diverted to his medical blocks, submitting formal requisitions to the camp administration, claiming he was conducting research into heredity, prenatal development, the effects of malnutrition and stress on fetal development, and racial characteristics observable before birth. In reality, he used these women for experiments that had no scientific value whatsoever beyond satisfying his sadistic curiosity. He performed cesarean sections without anesthesia to observe fetal development at various stages of pregnancy, from early second trimester through full term, then killed both mother and infant for dissection and comparative analysis. Women would be strapped to operating tables, fully conscious, while Mengele cut through their abdominal walls and uteruses, extracting fetuses while the mothers screamed. He injected pregnant women with various chemicals and pathogens: typhus, tuberculosis, Staphylococcus bacteria, chemical compounds of unknown composition, to study whether infections could cross the placental barrier. documenting the progression of disease in both mother and fetus through repeated invasive examinations until death occurred. Gisela Perl, a Jewish gynecologist from Romania forced to work in the women's camp, later wrote in her harrowing memoir, "I was a doctor in Auschwitz," that Mengele brought her pregnant women in various stages of labor, instructing her to perform experimental procedures during delivery. He wanted to know if Jewish women could deliver Aryan-looking babies. Perl testified in a 1948 affidavit. He would measure the infants immediately after birth, head circumference, body length, eye color, hair color if they had any, take blood samples, photograph them from multiple angles, then typically kill both mother and child within hours to perform autopsies comparing maternal and fetal tissue. I was forced to participate in these murders disguised as medical procedures. The guilt has haunted me every day since. Perl also revealed that she secretly intervened to terminate pregnancies before Mengele could identify the women, killing the fetuses to save the mothers from his experiments, an agonizing moral choice that saved dozens of women's lives. Mengele's experiments on children extended beyond twins to include any child with unusual physical characteristics that might provide insight into genetic variation or hereditary abnormalities. Dwarves, in particular, fascinated him as living examples of genetic mutation. When a transport from Hungary arrived in May 1944 carrying the Auschwitz family 7 dwarves and their normal-sized relatives, a total of 12 family members who worked as a traveling musical troupe called the Lilliput Troupe, Mengele was ecstatic, declaring it the find of the century and immediately sequestering them in special quarters separate from other prisoners. The Auschwitz family included Rosika, Franziska, Avram, Frida, Mickey, Elizabeth and Perla, ranging in age from 15 to 58, all suffering from pseudoachondroplasia, a form of dwarfism. For 7 months, from May 1944 until the camp's liberation in January 1945, Mengele subjected the Auschwitz family to daily examinations that began each morning at 8 o'clock, extracting bone marrow without anesthesia by drilling directly into their pelvic bones and spines, pulling teeth to study root formation and dental development in dwarves versus normal-sized people, pouring scalding water and ice water alternately into their ears to test vestibular reflexes and pain responses, and taking blood samples so frequently that the family members became severely anemic and required transfusions to survive. Perla Auschwitz, the youngest sister who survived until 2001, later recounted in interviews that Mengele treated us like prize specimens at a zoo, like exotic animals he had captured. He would bring visitors to look at us Nazi officials he wanted to impress with his collection, other SS doctors, even civilian scientists from Germany. We had to stand without clothing on a platform while he pointed out our physical differences, measuring us with metal calipers, comparing our proportions to normal-sized people to photographs of other dwarves in medical textbooks he kept in his office. The humiliation was worse than the pain, though the pain was considerable. My sister Rosika fainted during one bone marrow extraction. Mengele simply threw cold water on her face and continued the procedure. The scope of physical mutilations performed in Mengele's laboratories defied belief even among those who lived through Auschwitz's daily horrors. He conducted bone grafting experiments, removing bones from one prisoner, typically ribs, sections of femur, or entire fingers, and implanting them in another to test whether the body would accept foreign skeletal material, a crude precursor to modern transplant research, but performed without antiseptic conditions, proper surgical technique, or any consideration for patient survival beyond the duration of the experiment. Witnesses testified to seeing prisoners with missing limbs, prisoners whose bones had been broken and deliberately reset at strange angles to study healing processes and bone formation. Prisoners subjected to unnecessary amputations purely to provide surgical practice for SS medical students or to test different amputation techniques. Ella Lingens, an Austrian political prisoner who worked as a doctor in the women's camp, testified that she witnessed prisoners who had undergone what Mengele called orthopedic interventions, broken bones, amputations, bone grafts staggering through the camp in agony, their wounds infected, begging for death. One woman had her entire lower leg bone removed and replaced with a section of bone from another prisoner. She developed gangrene within 3 days and died screaming. Mengele maintained a particular interest in heterochromia, the condition where a person has 2 different colored eyes, actively seeking out prisoners with this rare trait during selections and among the existing camp population. When he found such individuals, he would typically murder them immediately with phenol injections to the heart to preserve their eyes and skulls as specimens, adding them to his growing anatomical collection that eventually numbered in the hundreds of preserved organs, bones, and tissue samples. One survivor, Judith Sternberg, recalled a young Polish girl named Marguerite, who had 1 blue eye and 1 brown eye. Mengele was fascinated by her. He examined her for hours, photographing her eyes from every angle, measuring her facial features. Then one day, she disappeared. We later heard from a prisoner who worked in the pathology lab that Mengele had killed her and preserved her eyes. She was 14 years old. The infection experiments represented another category of Mengele's research program, supposedly designed to test treatments for diseases affecting German troops on the Eastern Front, but actually serving as little more than torture masquerading as medicine. He deliberately infected prisoners with typhus, tuberculosis, scarlet fever, malaria, and various tropical diseases obtained from the SS Hygiene Institute, then tested different treatment protocols, experimental vaccines, untested medications, variations in dosage, or simply observed the progression of illness until death, documenting symptoms with clinical detachment. In some cases, he infected one twin with a disease while keeping the other healthy as a control subject, then killed both at the same time, often when the sick twin reached a critical stage of illness, to perform comparative autopsies on diseased versus healthy tissue. Vera Alexander, a Jewish prisoner from Slovakia who worked as a guard in the twins' barracks, testified at the Frankfurt trials that Mengele infected an entire block of twins with typhus in the summer of 1944. I watched children I had come to know, children who had been healthy that morning, laughing and playing with their toys, develop raging fevers by evening. They became delirious, crying for parents who were already dead, scratching at the red rashes covering their bodies. Within a week, most were dead. Mengele showed no emotion whatsoever. He simply recorded the data time of infection, progression of symptoms, body temperature every 4 hours, time of death, as if he were documenting a chemistry experiment. He had the bodies taken immediately to the crematorium for autopsy before they were even cold. Dr. Nyesli described assisting with these autopsies, examining tissues from twins who had died at different stages of typhus infection. Mengele wanted to understand how the disease progressed at a cellular level, how it damaged different organs. But this knowledge served no therapeutic purpose. He wasn't trying to save lives or develop better treatments. He was simply observing death in its various manifestations, cataloging the ways a human body breaks down and fails. The sterilization experiments conducted at Auschwitz, while often attributed to other SS doctors like Karl and Horst Schumann, also involved Mengele's participation and oversight, as he served on a committee evaluating different sterilization methods for efficiency and effectiveness. The Nazi leadership had long sought an efficient method for mass sterilization, a way to render entire populations infertile without the expense, time, and surgical resources required for individual procedures, part of the broader program of racial purification that envisioned sterilizing millions of Slavs, Jews, and other inferior peoples. Mengele tested various approaches in collaboration with his colleagues, including high-dose X-ray radiation directed at reproductive organs, injections of caustic substances into the uterus and fallopian tubes, and surgical castration performed under deliberately primitive conditions to determine the minimum intervention necessary to achieve permanent sterility. Male prisoners, often selected at random from the general camp population, were subjected to testicular injections of formaldehyde and other chemicals, procedures that caused excruciating pain, massive swelling, and often resulted in widespread infection that spread to the abdominal cavity, causing peritonitis and death. Women received intrauterine injections of silver nitrate, formalin, and experimental chemical compounds that caused massive hemorrhaging, severe cramping, and peritonitis in many cases. Those who survived were typically rendered permanently sterile, but left with chronic pain, scarring, and medical complications that plagued them for the rest of their lives. Alina Bruder, a Jewish doctor from Poland forced to assist with these procedures, testified that the screams of the women could be heard throughout the block. They would writhe on the examination tables, begging for mercy, but the injections continued. Some died within hours from shock and hemorrhaging. Others lingered for days, suffering from infections that turned their bodies septic. Perhaps most disturbing was how Mengele cloaked these atrocities in the language and procedures of legitimate medical research, maintaining an elaborate pretense of scientific rigor that persists in the extensive documentation he left behind. He insisted on proper record-keeping, maintaining detailed charts for each subject, with patient numbers, dates, procedures performed, measurements taken, and results observed. He recorded measurements and observations with scientific precision, using standardized medical terminology, creating elaborate tables and graphs, preserving tissue samples according to proper histological protocols learned during his university training, and corresponding with von Verschuer and other mainstream scientists about his findings, using language that suggested genuine scientific collaboration. He published nothing during the war years, recognizing perhaps that his methods would not survive peer review, but his letters to von Verschuer, later discovered by Allied investigators in the ruins of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, discussed his research in terms that suggested an ongoing scientific dialogue between respected colleagues. In one letter from September 1944, Mengele wrote enthusiastically, "I have been able to advance our twin studies significantly with the material available here. The possibilities for research are truly unlimited. I have processed over 200 pairs in the last 3 months alone, with particularly interesting findings regarding genetic markers for eye pigmentation and hereditary disease resistance. The blood samples and tissue specimens I am sending should prove invaluable for the Institute's work." Von Verschuer, in his responses, encouraged this work and requested specific samples and data, making him complicit in crimes he never directly witnessed, but certainly understood, given the quantities of human tissue Mengele was shipping. After the war, von Verschuer would claim complete ignorance about the source of the materials Mengele sent him, insisting under oath that he believed they came from routine medical examinations of volunteers rather than deadly experiments on prisoners. But his correspondence suggests he knew far more than he later admitted. In a 1943 letter, he wrote to Mengele, "Your access to such abundant research material is extraordinary and presents opportunities that would be impossible under normal circumstances. Please continue documenting everything in detail." The medical profession's corruption under Nazi ideology found its ultimate expression in Mengele's Auschwitz laboratory, where the Hippocratic Oath's fundamental principle, first, do no harm, was inverted into a systematic program of harm disguised as healing. Mengele maintained the outward appearance of a physician throughout his time at Auschwitz, wearing a white coat during experiments, using medical terminology, sterilizing instruments before procedures, documenting results in medical charts, and maintaining a laboratory equipped with microscopes, surgical tools, and specimen preservation equipment. Yet every aspect of this medical theater served death rather than life. As Robert J. Lifton observed in his groundbreaking study, The Nazi Doctors, Medical Killing and the Psychology of Genocide, Mengele represented the complete inversion of healing and killing, creating what Lifton termed biological purification through medical means. The children in Mengele's care quickly learned to fear the sound of his footsteps in the corridor, the sight of his white coat approaching their bunks, the smell of the disinfectant and formaldehyde that preceded painful procedures. Alex Diekel, a survivor who was a teenager at Auschwitz, later testified in a 1985 interview, "We knew that when Dr. Mengele appeared at the barracks door with his assistants and his medical bag, someone would not return. He had this routine. He would enter very calmly, almost cheerfully, sometimes humming a tune. The younger children would hide under beds or behind bunks, crying and begging not to be chosen. But there was nowhere to hide. Mengele would walk through slowly, almost leisurely, selecting subjects the way someone might select apples at a market looking for the best specimens, the most interesting cases, those who would provide the most useful data. He would point with his riding crop, you, and you. And that was it. Your fate was sealed. The surviving twins, those who outlasted Mengele's experiments through sheer chance, would carry both physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives, bearing witness to crimes that transformed medicine from a healing profession into an instrument of systematic murder. In the shadow of Auschwitz, between 1943 and 1945, Josef Mengele, the angel of death, turned science into something unrecognizable. His fascination with twins, heredity, and genetic perfection became a dark mirror, reflecting the limits of human cruelty. The echoes of his experiments remind us that ethics are the soul of knowledge. As one survivor, Eva Moses Kaur, once said, "Forgiving is not forgetting, it is freedom from hate." Let us remember not to dwell in horror, but to ensure that curiosity never again forgets compassion. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.